Episode 8, Fish, Cod, and some other things. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at the role fish played in the settlement and growth of the British Atlantic colonies in the 17th century, and how they dealt with fish when there was no refrigeration. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. If you are familiar with the book Cod by Mark Kurlansky, you may find yourself saying, "Hey, aren't you just summarizing that book?" And your impression wouldn't be completely wrong. Mr. Kurlansky does pull information about the life of fish as a commodity in general, and cod in particular, very well. But there is more. As I was looking around in corn and iron and sugar, or looking ahead at things like wood and pickling and ketchup and fat, I realized information about the fishing economy of the world is always right there once you know what you are looking at. My own looking about simply confirmed, yes, the fishing industry is tied to all these things. And as I have said, and will likely keep saying, this is another part of American food that is heavily tangled up with technology and war. There will only be this one episode in the 17th century all about fish, because unlike some of the other items, one, though way back here the development of bony fish from the primordial ooze adds nothing to the story I want to tell, and two, fishing hadn't evolved all that much by the 17th century, so normally what I'd have to go back and talk about is just what was going on in the 17th century. As a result, information about fish, mainly smaller schooling fish and cod, how they made the 17th century happen, has yet again shifted around the way I understand the development of American food and society. The first thing to grasp is that until the last quarter of the 20th century, for most people in the world, there was no such thing as truly fresh fish. In the 17th century, unless your family fished, I mean someone was personally pulling fish out of the water, the fish you ate was dried, salted, smoked, pickled, jellied, potted, or purposefully rotted into a pungent and potent condiment. The only exception was if you were one of the tiny number of people who lived in a monastery, manor house, or castle rich enough to have fish ponds, or you were the king. Kings and other such wealthy land-holding persons could have their fresh fish without dirtying their hands. But that was about it. For the rest of the world, fish had the business done to them to make them transportable, tradable, and keepable for later. This was particularly important in Europe because about half the days of the year had come to be holy days or fast days. By the 17th century, a fast day did not mean you went without food. It just meant you went without the meat of warm-blooded animals. Early in Christianity, fast days might mean eating nothing, or only bread, salt, and water, later adding in some vegetable matter. But Christianity expanded beyond the ascetic religious communities that sat around and prayed and lived off the charity of others. In Europe, along with the cloistered religious, farmers, laborers, warriors, and all the women, wives, daughters, servants, and slaves that lived among them were Christians. So the habit of not eating or barely eating wasn't going to fly. To keep society flowing, getting on with the rigorous activities of tending fields, processing flax, building roads, feeding children, defending the borders, chopping wood, and hauling water, fast days came to mean not eating certain things instead of not eating at all. The good news for peasants and the non-nobility was that by the 17th century, Europe was stable enough and food technology had advanced enough that eating meat was something that was regularly attainable for much more of the population than it had been in the early and high Middle Ages. But the Catholic Church had made lots of rules about when you could eat meat, because even then it was recognized that meat was a bit of a luxury, and it was believed that too much might make one over-energetic in some not-so-Christian ways. Thus, going back to the medical authorities of Galen and Avicenna, it made sense to eliminate the foods most likely to make one too sanguine and lusty. Thus, the items most associated with breaking the mildness and sullying the pure heart of the ideal ascetic Christian were meat, flesh, and wine. Certain other spices, often the most expensive ones for what it's worth, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, sugar, saffron, were also considered particularly exciting, and were thus often stricken during fast days. But fish, as cold, wet things, along with the cold, dry root vegetables, were perfectly suited to counteract too much sanguinity and passion, and put one in a more contemplative frame of mind, as modeled by such thought leaders as St. Augustine or St. Francis. So the Catholic Church was super-duper team fish. Diets of only vegetables were also good as long as one didn't get too righteous and possibly heretical about it. But for the average peasant in the field, fish as a fast day food to go along with the bread and pottage was A-OK. The growing merchant consortiums were also team fish. By the 17th century, these were storable, tradable, negotiable items, and lots of fishing boats meant plenty of sailors for the merchant marine service. For the same reason, many European governments, especially Spain, Portugal, France, England, the Belgian/Holland/Low Countries area, and the Scandinavian kingdoms, along with many of the Mediterranean principalities/polities/entities, also saw a healthy fishing industry as an important arrow in their quiver of national defense assets. A fishing fleet was sort of the naval reserve. So while fish were not war in fact, fish were war in potentia. This issue will not have faded one bit in the 18th century. By the 17th century, the entire suite of fish-catching methods were in use. Metallurgy made its contribution in iron hooks and spears, brass ship fittings, and lead weights on lines and nets. Fishing poles and lines, nets both cast and set by boats, or on piles were in use, as were fish traps in streams, river mouths, and on shores that had large tidal changes. Single fish methods like spears and lines were for larger fish like pike, turbot, cod, sturgeon, sharks, whales, dolphins, and porpoises. Yep, at that time they were definitely considered by nearly everyone to be fish. Nets were mostly for small fish like mackerel, anchovies, minnows, herring, stuff like that. Traps were mostly used in streams on freshwater fish and eels, or in fish like salmon and alewives. You know, those corn fertilizer fish, by the way? And shad. These are anadromous fish. They come back into freshwater to spawn after living most of their adult life in saltwater. Heck, many of the earliest written laws in England and Europe had to do with access to fish in rivers and streams. Even then, catching more fish than you were using in a day was dirty pool. And wasting was a sin. Nearly all fish in 17th century Europe and the British colonies had the dickens cooked out of it. Your average 17th century person would have looked with envy and approval and delight at a breaded fried fish sandwich. They probably would have ditched the raw lettuce, but requested double tartar sauce and may have questioned the potatoes, depending on where in Europe and when in the 17th century they were, and would have absolutely approved the ketchup, possibly requesting an extra cup for drinking later, all that sugar, but might have had some suggestions about adding extra spices or letting it ferment a bit for richer flavor. Every last 17th century person, on the other hand, would have asked what horrible sin you were atoning for by eating barely cooked fish with nothing more than a squeeze of lemon. And sure, while in 17th century Edo Japan vinegared raw fish was a thing, in North America they would have wondered yet again what horrible thing you had done that you were mortifying your body with the consumption of gasp raw food. Remember, in most of 17th century Europe, even the consumption of raw fruit, not to mention vegetables, and raw meat, was viewed with emotions ranging from guarded suspicion to fear. So over in the British Atlantic colonies, fishing was an important part of what the colonies were for. In fact, the Pilgrims had planned to, quote, serve God and to fish, unquote. The fishing part, with a few other money-making tasks, was to pay off the funding they had acquired to get the boat trip over. The fact that they didn't know how, don't appear to have brought equipment, lacked boating skills or fish preserving facilities, makes one wonder how that was going to work out. Now, the reason their backers thought it was possible was because there was a regular and wildly successful fishery from Newfoundland to Cape Cod. And I guess you figured out by now how Cape Cod got its name. That fishery had been going on since at least the mid-16th century, if not earlier, because late medieval fisherfolk were no more forthcoming about the best fishing spots then than they are now. In fact, the only big money John Smith ever made in all of his New World adventures was a boatload of cod he brought back from this one trip exploring New England. But clearly, the New World fisheries didn't have the freezers of the modern fishing fleet. Just how were those catches preserved to become a commodity? For fish like cod and haddock that are low in fat and are slower moving cold water fish, these dry very well hung from poles or placed on racks on a cold, windy shore, like in Newfoundland, just as they were preserved in Iceland and Scandinavia. These air-dried fish could last at least a year in cold climates and up to several months in warmer places. Salted and dried, these fish would last up to 5 years at room temperature from the North Sea all the way to the tropics. And while they were often rinsed and reconstituted to make tasty fish stews, pies, farces, as sort of a mixed meat pate, they can also simply be pounded with a hammer or even a rock to loosen the fibers and chewed on, like a sort of rough fish jerky. As you might guess, this was, and in places still is, the premium of preserved fish. Smaller school fish, caught in nets like herring and anchovies, are oily and do not dry well. These were usually subject to a combination of salting and then smoking or pickling in brine. A particular regimen of salting and smoking produced the red herring of mystery novel fame. It gained its notoriety as a distraction, not because there was no such thing, there clearly was, but because red herring were apparently an irresistible distraction to hunting dogs that should be off chasing deer or foxes. These poor dogs would be led astray by carts carrying them or by village shops that had them on display. Thus, Agatha Christie had her fun. By the 17th century, salted dried herring were a common food of the soldiers and the poor. I know, I just said they didn't dry particularly well, and these were not particularly good. They would often be rancid, moldy, or oversalted, and reviled by their audience. But they were better than nothing, and nothing was often the only other option for the urban working poor or a soldier or sailor under military discipline. On the other hand, the salted and brine pickled herring and anchovies from barrels were considered fit food for responsible citizens and the quality alike. Their deep flavor was appreciated and sought either as a base of sauces, stews, pies, and other elaborate dishes, or straight up with bread, mustard, and pickled vegetables. Smoked fish would always start as salted. Sometimes a bit of sugar, molasses, or spice might be part of the cure. Then the fish would be hot smoked, that is, cooked and partly dried with hot smoke, or it could be cold smoke, where it's more bathed in smoke below a cooking temperature. Neither of these methods produced something that was stable for long, but they did give fish a week or two of cool pantry shelf life, which was often plenty. Smoking was used both on regular fish, cod, herring, and the like, but also on the more noble, rarer luxury fish like salmon, trout, sturgeon, and so on. And a quick detour here for jellied fish, what we know as lutefisk. Like salt fish, it was first air-dried, but instead of a salt bath, it was treated with a lye solution instead, which, as you remember from corn, is made by soaking wood ash. The pH of 11 or so would turn the fish to a sort of jelly and preserve it for longer than just drying it would, the same way salt does. Scandinavia definitely didn't have the sun required to make evaporated salt, and there were no handy salt mines like in the German principalities. But open hearth cooking meant there was always plenty of ash. In colonial America, the development of the fishing industry was along the lines it had followed in Europe. Subsistence methods were the starting point, but were followed up as the colonies got going. Fish like salmon, sturgeon, and other non-schooling fish were never commodities. They were either luxury fish or were eaten by those who caught them. But there were plenty of cod and seasonal schooling fish like shad, alewives, and porgies, known as poor Johns in England. These were commodities. Once the colonies developed, port facilities, boatyards, warehouses, and fish processing facilities, they entered the transatlantic production market. Generally, the northern colonies were fish producers and processors, and the southern colonies that centered around plantations with large land-bound labor forces, both in the fields and in the support industries, were mainly fish consumers. The Caribbean colony sugar plantations were definitely fish consumers. Those purchases fed a lot of money into the northern colonies. While in Europe, salted and badly dried herring was the food of the poor, in America, where cod was really the catch, it was inferior grades of cod that became the food of the poor. In the latter half of the 17th century, as the colonial cod industry grew, there were high-quality, large fish, expertly cleaned, split, well-dried, and correctly salted, that went back to Europe. Portugal, Spain, and in general, the Mediterranean Catholic ports were the enthusiastic consumers of the highest quality fish. There was also a crop of late fishing season fish that got what was called a green cure. They were salted, but they were barreled in brine still wet, instead of the hard, dried fish. Most of this green cure fish would stay in North America or go to the colder countries. Green cured fish tends to go bad fairly quickly in warmer weather, so it was not a popular item in Southern Europe and around the Mediterranean. In the cod industry, as in every growth industry, there was also quite a bit of middling and substandard product, smaller, poorly cleaned, incompletely dried, over or undersalted. This rapidly became the default provision for the laboring classes in the South and the Caribbean sugar plantation slaves. A bulk, cheap, warehouse-stable protein that could be consumed with limited preparation, and that provided the much-needed salt to those working in hot conditions, was a boon to both the provisioners of the working poor and plantation owners. But this is about more than catching and processing. What about eating? Just what was a fish dish in the 17th century British colonies? The first and safest answer? Stew. Except for the fish pulled from the water, cleaned on the spot, and then placed over the fire, which, let's face it, really was recognized then and still is appreciated as the very best way to eat them. All fish were cooked, and then cooked just a bit more for good measure. And stew was the easiest way to do that. After all, even fresh fish that had just come in from the coast, even if it was just a mile or two away, would usually be getting a bit ripe by the time they hit the stew pot or the spider. Fish on the hearth was usually cooked until very done and thus very dry, which is why, if not in a stew, puddles of butter and rich, creamy sauces were the order of the day. Though even then, sour ingredients like sorrel, verjus, unripe grapes, vinegar, and sumac were recognized as essential parts of the sauces. Eventually, lemons and limes would be part of the lineup as they arrived in the fancier homes of the New World. Fish stews, often thickened with hard biscuits or ground grain, would often bubble away at the back of the hearth for hours. Since the fish often would be one of the several very hearty preserved preparations, it made sense that several hours would be needed to make the fish palatable. So if it was a freshish-ish fish that ended up toughened, it would still be tastier than a stewed, badly cured herring. Thickened and reduced stews would also be the fillings for most fish pies. Though as the century rolled on, there would be tables wealthy enough to have flounder, salmon, sturgeon, or other luxury fish within a pastry crust that imitated the fish in action. They would have carved scales, decorative fins, and plumped raisins or blanched almonds for eyes. Fish were also baked in pots with herbs and stocks, or wine and ale. They were fricasseed, roasted, stuffed, and made into ragouts and sauces and gravies. Fish were pan-fried, though often they would be finished further by roasting or baking. Like I said, 17th century fish had the dickens cooked out of it. And there was no deep-fried fish in 17th century North America. There are a few things that are needed for such a thing to happen, and they aren't present yet. There are not enough lard hogs to create the necessary cauldrons of fat. The Dutch and French did have some deep-fried sweets at this point, but one wouldn't sully such fat with stinky fish. Then there needs to be enough milled grain to use it for things besides bread and porridges. And at this point, much of the milling is still done by hand. Any large mills are likely for export, and those still require large amounts of muscle power. And a final mixing of the ideas of the Dutch donut or oil cake, the French fritter, and the West African challah haven't had time to hang out and chat. For this idea exchange will be absolutely essential to finally getting America to the point where we dip things in a batter so they can be deep fried. And in the 17th century British Atlantic, we just weren't there yet. Until that happens, the fish hand pie, a pasty in Britain and North America, an empanada or pastille in South America. These were the preferred ways to eat fish on the go. What all this means is fish were food for the masses and the elite in 17th century America. It would get fancier sauces, many more spices, and larger puddles of butter as you went up the social ladder. But everyone ate fish. Usually it was salted, smoked, and dried, and nearly always cooked and cooked and cooked a little bit more. Fish docks, processing factories, warehouses, and markets then were far more pungent than they are now. The wind-burned, bearded fisherman, calloused and squinting from wrangling an open boat, and the fishwife with raw hands from gutting and scaling fish all day at the market were no exaggeration. The crowds of yowling cats that wandered about the edges of old Looney Tune cartoon shorts would have been the reality. But for the fisherman and his family, in salt water or by the stream, there was the culinary jewel of fresh fish cooked over a waterside fire. The fact that this remains now the treat it was then means some things still translate over space and time. Next week, that necessity for making fish a commodity, salt, will be the topic. For without mountains of salt, fish never makes it inland. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with any promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. I'd also really appreciate a quick rating and review on your podcast widget to make it easier for people to find the show. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and in the show's description.